Welcome to this week's Parsha, Shiur, Parsha's Beshalach. Looking forward to share with you three beautiful ideas on this week's Parsha. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com and I'll send you the handouts. The first offering is an Ibn Ezra. Take a look at the first box. The Pasuk says, Vayirdufu Mitzrayim achareihem. And the Mitzrayim are chasing after Klal Yisrael. They have just left Mitzrayim after all these years. Vayasigu eisom choinim al hayom. And they catch up with Klal Yisrael, who are now encamped by the Yam Suf. Vayisu b'nei Yisrael eseinehem. And the Jewish people raise their eyes. V'hinei Mitzrayim noiseh achareihem. And their worst fears, the Egyptians are chasing after them. Vayiru ma'id, they're very scared. Vayitzaku b'nei Yisrael Hashem, and they cry out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vayomer el Moshe, and they say to Moshe, Hamibli en kvarim b'Mitzrayim, were there not enough graves in Egypt? Lakachtonu lamas b'midbar, that you're taking us out to be killed in the midbar? Vayomer Moshe el ha'am, and Moshe Rabbeinu says to Klal Yisrael, Al tiru, do not be scared. Hisyatzvu uru'u es Yeshuas Hashem. Stand up and see the salvation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Asher Yaseh lochem hayom, that He will do for you today. Hashem yilochem lochem, va'atem tacharishon. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will fight on your behalf, and you can just remain silent. Famous psukim. Says the Ibn Ezra a very interesting question. Yesh litmoya, says the Ibn Ezra, Eich yira machane godel, shel sheish me'es elef ish. How could 600,000 men, between the ages of 20 and 60, be scared from those who are pursuing them? Why didn't they fight back? What an interesting question. You've got 600,000 men of fighting age, between the ages of 20 and 60. Why didn't they fight back? They way outnumber those who are pursuing them. Why were they so frozen in fear? Says the Ibn Ezra, Hatshuva, the answer is, Ki ha-Mitzrayim hoyu adonim l'Yisrael. The Mitzrayim were the masters and the oppressors of the Jewish people. V'zeh hadar hayotzim Mitzrayim. And this generation that came out of Egypt, Lomad min urav, they were trained from their youth, Lispol oil Mitzrayim, to absorb the yoke of Egypt, v'nafshei shefela, and their spirit was low. They had been born into slavery. This is all they're used to. They couldn't entertain, they couldn't contemplate the possibility of fighting back against their masters who have persecuted them for decades. For Yisrael nirpim, they were weak, and they were not trained in war. Halotira, says the Ibn Ezra. I'll prove it to you, says the Ibn Ezra. Because a little later on, in a different encounter, Amalek come and attack the Jewish people, and they're a very small number. Lulei tfilas Moshe hayocholesh Yisrael, were it not for the prayer of Moshe Rabbeinu, they would have been victorious over the Jewish people. And therefore, you see that Klal Yisrael had a slave mentality. They were sort of impressed in their consciousness almost, was to be subordinate to Mitzrayim, and therefore they were petrified. Now, I looked at this on Shabbos, and I daven early in Hashkama, and then I come home, and then a little later on I was looking for things to share in the Parsha Shiur, and I came across this Ibn Ezra, and I thought to myself, this sounds like a very similar Ibn Ezra in Parsha Shmos. We once said it in a shiur some years ago in the Moshe Rabbeinu, the making of Moshe Rabbeinu or something, I think like that, and there, the Ibn Ezra says a very interesting thing. He says, why is it that Moshe Rabbeinu grew up in the palace of Paro? It seems so unlikely. Why didn't he just grow up with his brothers, with the Jewish people? Why this very unusual background? And if you take a look at the next box, I'm going to come back to this Ibn Ezra in a minute, but look at the Ibn Ezra in Parsha Shmos. He says, Ulai sibib Hashem zeh sheyigadol Moshe b'beis hamalchus. That why is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrated that Moshe Rabbeinu grows up in the palace of Paro? It was in order that he has a royal training. This would imbue him with a certain confidence and regality. And he wouldn't have that slave mentality that he would have had he grown up with his brothers, with the rest of Klal Yisrael, who were all persecuted. I'll prove it to you, says Ibn Ezra, Shehorag HaMitzri Ba'avur Shehu Osa Chomos, because he had the confidence that when Vayigdal Moshe, he went out and he struck the Mitzri and he stood up for any injustice. For Hoshea B'nos Midyan Meharoim, and he intervened and he saved the daughters of Yisro from the Midyanite Roim. Ba'avur Shehu Osim Chomos Lahashko Soinam Mehamayim Shedalu. Okay. So I was so that it occurred to me that that's sort of a good connecting Ibn Ezra, a good sushtel, as they say. Later Shabbos morning, I went to a few Keddashim to say Mazel Tov, and I met at one of the Keddashim a friend of mine who is an expert on the Ibn Ezra. He's written Sfarim on the Ibn Ezra. So I said to him, I had a machshava that the Ibn Ezra in Parsha Beshalach connects very beautifully with the Ibn Ezra in Parsha Shemos. He said, how so? So I explained to him that the Ibn Ezra says, why didn't they fight back? So the Ibn Ezra explains, because they had a slave mentality, they couldn't contemplate the possibility of fighting back against the masters who had subordinated them to that extent for so many decades. It was just impossible for them to contemplate. And I said that fits into the Ibn Ezra. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu says the Ibn Ezra grew up in the palace of Paro, to give him that confidence and that regal bearing that he wouldn't have had if he grew up with Klal Yisrael in the Beis Avodim, in the house of slavery, being persecuted. And he said, you're absolutely right. He said he thought of it himself, and in fact in his Sefer he says he makes that connection. And the truth is, the Ibn Ezra refers to it a little bit further on. Because if you go back to the second box, the Ibn Ezra says something very interesting. He says, V'Hashem, I'm in the last 3 lines of the second box on the page. This is the Ibn Ezra in Parshas Beshalach. V'Hashem sivev shemeisu kol ha'om. Listen to this. Says the Ibn Ezra, HaKadosh Baruch Hu orchestrated it, that Klal Yisrael, the Dar that came out of Mitzrayim, died in the Midbar, ki ein bohem koach le'elochim b'knanim. Because what was the next chapter in the story? They were going to go into Eretz Yisrael, and they were going to overcome all the inhabitants of Eretz Yisrael, the Canaanite nations. And if it was the Dar HaMidbar, i.e. the Yetze Mitzrayim who would go into Eretz Canaan, they weren't built like that. They didn't have the fortitude to fight against the inhabitants of Mitzrayim. Achekom dar achadar hamidbar, until the next generation came, shelo ro golus, they weren't born and brought up in the golus of Mitzrayim. V'hoyselohem nefesh gavoya, they had a stronger, loftier spirit. Like I mentioned regarding Moshe and the Eilish Shemos, and I suspect that is exactly what the Ibn Ezra is referring to, that comment that I made reference to regarding why Moshe Rabbeinu grew up in the palace of Paro. It's interesting, you're conditioned very much by your youth, for better or for worse. They often tell of the circus elephant. The circus elephant, when you look at him and you go to a circus and you see this enormous elephant, he can weigh 5,000 kilograms, which in stone is 800 stone, 11,000 pounds, a huge weight. And an elephant is a very strong animal, can uproot trees and can do enormous damage. And yet, if you look at the circus elephant, there's a little peg in the ground, and there's a small rope from the peg around the foot of the elephant. And somehow the elephant is trained to stay exactly where it is on its spot, and it won't pull out the peg. And you think to yourself, this elephant is so strong, it can uproot enormous trees, and yet a tiny peg that's fixed into the ground, it won't just pull out. Why is that? And the answer famously given is that when the elephant is just born, from a very young age, they train the elephant, they put the peg in the ground, and they put a rope around its leg, and then at that stage, for a very short while, a few days perhaps, it hasn't got the strength to pull out the peg. But because it's trained from such a young age that it cannot do it, in its consciousness almost, he just thinks to himself, well, this is impossible. I can never do it. And then the weeks and the months and the years pass where it certainly can pull out the peg, but it just doesn't think he can. Because you're trained with that mindset from a young age. And it can work l'tov as well. It can work for in a good way as well. I made reference to this anecdote in the Shiur of the making of Moshe Rabbeinu. I forget which year I gave it, but 2 anecdotes. One anecdote is about Rav Belsky. Rav Belsky was the very beloved Rosh Hashiva of Torah Vadas, and a remarkable personality. And whether I've read his biography or whether it was there or in a different source that I saw it, an interview or something that was once reported about him, a beautiful anecdote. That one time he was asked to tell about his youth and his upbringing. And he said something fascinating. And I think it was about his mother, who was the daughter of Beshalach of Mendelovitz. If I'm not mistaken, that was his grandfather. But he said that when he would go to bed, and his mother would put him to bed as a very young child every night, his mother would put him to bed and would say Shema, and would always sing him the same song, night after night. Now, what was that song? If I'd give you 100 guesses, I don't think you'd get it. Rav Belsky, the Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'das, being put to bed by his mother, who, if I'm not mistaken, was the daughter of Shraga of Mendelovitz, what song do you think she would sing him? I would venture to suggest Hamalach HaGoyel or something of that ilk. But that wasn't what she sang him. She sang him the song, You Are My Sunshine. You Are My Sunshine. Remember that song? She sang him that song. Now the words are very powerful. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are grey. I forget the rest of the song, the rest of the words. But if a mother puts a child to bed night after night and says to him, you are my sunshine, you make me happy when skies are grey, that instills in you a tremendous confidence. You feel warm with love. And that helps you achieve things in later life. Rav Belsky was an incredibly accomplished person. But it was that upbringing, the warmth, the love that he felt as a young child, no doubt, with a lot of his own efforts as well, but that helped him in later life. One further anecdote. There's a book which I've read some years ago, a fabulous book. Someone bought me as a present, a book called Rebbe, all about the Lubavitcher Rebbe by someone called Rabbi Joseph Tulushkin. It's an excellent book, and I didn't know much about Chabad as much as the next guy, but someone bought me this book, and I read it, and it was fascinating. And there's an anecdote in the Sefer there in the book which tells of Senator Joe Lieberman. Now, Senator Joe Lieberman, who passed away not long ago, was the closest we've probably come to having a frum vice president of America. Joe Lieberman was, I think it was in 2000, he was Al Gore's running mate, I think that's correct. And it went very, very close. The Thursday was election day, and eventually at 3-4 in the morning, whatever time it was, they came very close, but he came home dejected, just by the way, as only a wife could say with a wonderful sense of humor. He came home licking his wounds, Erev Shabbos of that day after the election, and she consoled him with a smile and said to him, Joe, in this house you'll always be vice president. Okay. But he tells an anecdote in his book that on the campaign trail, Joe Lieberman was the potential vice president, and he went around all the great cities of America. And it was high security, of course. This is elections and campaigns, and this is very high-profile politicians. And they went to, crisscrossing America, and it was top secret which hotel they would stay in the big cities in America. And despite it being top secret, whenever he went into the chosen hotel and he went to his room, there was a meal waiting for him from the local Chabad. Now, how on earth? How did they bypass security to manage to A, find out which hotel they were staying at, and B, to find out his room, to leave a meal there? So Rabbi Tulushkin suggests the following theory. Take it or leave it, but it's an interesting theory. He says that a 14 or 15-year-old Chabad yeshiva bacher who stands on street corners and says, excuse me, sir, are you Jewish? Can I put tefillin on you? That creates a certain thick skin that any wall that you encounter in life, you'll overcome it. And that's how they managed to put the meal in Joe Lieberman's hotel room. Maybe, but that's the point, that a person is very much conditioned by his upbringing, for better or for worse. Of course, one can, with time, overcome it, but it's somehow deeply embedded in you. And that's pshat, I think, in the Ibn Ezra. That's why Klal Yisrael didn't fight back, because of this slave mentality. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu didn't grow up with Klal Yisrael, like the Ibn Ezra says in Parsha Shmos, and he is the one who can turn around to Klal Yisrael and say, Al tiru hisyatzvu v'ru es yeshuas Hashem asher yaseh lochem hayom, because he grew up in the palace of Paro and he didn't have this slave mentality that like the rest of Klal Yisrael. Okay, let's press on. So the pasuk says, "Vayisa malach Elokim ha'olech lifnei machane Yisrael," and the malach Elokim was still at the Yam Suf, traveled with them in front of the Machane Yisrael, vayelech me'achareihem, and it went from behind them, vayisa amut ha'onon mipneihem vayam me'achareihem, and the cloud, the pillar of cloud, went from in front of them to behind them to protect Klal Yisrael, like Rashi says. Now, Rashi also picks up on the point that it says in the pasuk, vayisa malach Elokim. Why Elokim? Says Rashi, b'chol makom, I'm at the penultimate box on the first page, b'chol makom ho'im malach Hashem. Normally it says Malach Hashem, the Khan, Malach Elokim, but here at the Yam Suf, the pasuk says Malach Elokim. Ein Elokim b'chol makom eladin. Elokim is always used as an expression of din, of strict, harsh judgment. Melamed, this teaches us, Shehoyu Yisrael nesunim badin ba'is hashad. At that moment, when Klal Yisrael were at the Yam Suf, they were on the edge of a knife. They were on a very difficult predicament. They were being judged. They were nesunim badin. Imle Notzel, whether they're going to be saved, Imle Ha'ovid, or they're going to be destroyed, in Mitzrayim with the rest of Mitzrayim. That's Rashi. No doubt, Rashi, his Makar, there are a few sources, but presumably the Makar is Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah there, the bottom box, says, B'shashe Yotzu Yisrael Mitzrayim Omad Samuel HaMalach. When they came out of Egypt, Samuel, the Malach, came to be Mekatrig, Lekatrig Oison, to indict Klal Yisrael. Omad Lefnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Malach Samuel said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Ribono Shel Olam, Ad Achshav Hoyu Eilu Ovdim Avodas Kechavim. Until now, these Jewish people were worshipping Avodah Zarah. Va'ataker Elohem Es Hayom, and you're going to split the sea for them. As often it's expressed as Halolu Ovdei Avodah Zarah, V'Halolu Ovdei Avodah Zarah. The people chasing them, the Egyptians, are Ovdei Avodah Zarah, and these people, Bnei Yisrael at the Yam Suf, are also Ovdei Avodah Zarah. Ad Kan, well-known Chazal. The difficulty is the following. The pasuk says in Parshas Boy, in last week's Edra, Vayet Moshe es yod al hashamayim v'yichoshech hafeidah b'chol eretz Mitzrayim. The plague of Choshech. Says Rashi, Lama hevi aleim Choshech. Why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring darkness on the Mitzrayim? Says Rashi famously, Sheho Yisrael ba'is hador hashoim. There were Jewish people in that generation who were wicked. V'lo hoyu roitzim lotzes. They didn't want to go. And they died in the 3 days of darkness, so the Mitzrayim wouldn't see their punishment, their downfall. That they all too are being smitten like us. And that's Pshat in this week's Sedra. V'chamushim olu b'nei Yisrael. Rashi's in his second Pshat in V'chamushim is Echad mechamisha yotzu. Only 1/5 came out. V'arba chalokim meisu b'shloshim alfeila. As a reference to that, to what we've just said. The question, therefore, if you think about it, is obvious. And the question is simple. Are you telling me, according to what we've said earlier, that the Klal Yisrael who were standing at the Yam Suf, Halolu Ovdei Avodah Zarah, Halolu Ovdei Avodah Zarah, the Mitzrayim Ovdei Avodah Zarah, and these Jewish people standing at the Yam Suf Ovdei Avodah Zarah? But didn't we just say that 4/5 who were Rishonim died in the Makkah of Choshech, and 1/5 came out? So they were worthy. So how can you now call them Ovdei Avodah Zarah? Very strange. I heard this question is discussed in Mefarshim, and I have notes, my Parsha notes, so when I prepare the Shiur, I look at my notes from previous years, try not to repeat, and see what I've left over for future years, and then look for more material. Last year, and I don't know who it was, but I have notes in my Parsha notes that Parshas Beshalach last year, we had a guest. I don't know who he is, I've got no recollection of it. And he said a Dvar Torah, which I obviously liked, and on Motzei Shabbos I made a note of it and put it in my Parsha notes. And he quoted Reb Chaim Peretz Berman. Reb Chaim Peretz Berman is one of the Rosh Yeshivas of Ponevezh. He's the son of Reb Shloimeh Berman. Reb Shloimeh Berman was a very illustrious figure who sadly died relatively young. He was the son-in-law of the Steipler. He came to Ponevezh as a 14-year-old boy many decades ago in the early years of Ponevezh, and he stood out as an Ilui amongst a very prestigious crowd. And he caught the attention not only of the Rosh Yeshiva, Reb Shach and Reb David Pavarsky, and even of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish took a very strong liking to him and learned with him. I think he even slept in his house for a number of years, and they learned together every evening. And he suggested him as a shidduch for his niece, i.e. the daughter of the stipler. And anyway, he passed away, I think, about 20 or so years ago, Reb Shloimeh Berman. And his son, Reb Chaim Peretz Berman, is now one of the Rosh Yeshivas of Ponevezh, an outstanding Talmid Chacham. And anyway, so this guest, whoever it was, last year, said the following answer. So again, what's the question? The question is, in this week's Parsha, we're told that halal of the Avodah Zarah, halal of the Avodah Zarah, that the Mitzrayim over the Avodah Zarah and the Klal Yisrael were standing at the Yam Suf were worshipping Avodah Zarah, and therefore they were Nesunim Bedin. That's why the pasuk says Vayisa Malach Elokim. Elokim is Lashon Din. But yet we were told in last week's Sedra, Rashi says that why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu bring the Makkah of Cheshech? Because they were Jewish people at that time who were Rishaim and were worthy of dying, and therefore HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to sort of disguise their death in the Makkah of Choshech so that the Mitzrayim wouldn't see it. They were the 4/5 that Rashi refers to in this week's Sedra. The 1/5 came out, but 4/5 didn't. Why not? Because the 4/5 weren't worthy. The implication, of course, is the 1/5 were good. They were okay. They were worthy. They were merited to come out. But yet we're told that halal of the Avodah Zarah. How do you explain it? So Reb Chaim Peretz Berman says a very simple answer. He says, Ein hachanami, you're quite right, that Klal Yisrael sadly were influenced by the Egyptian society and they did worship Avodah Zarah. But 4/5 felt that they were stuck and there was nothing they could do. They had given up hope, and as Rashi alludes to, Lo hoya roitzim lotzeis. But the 1/5 recognized they had a problem, but they were hopeful. They were still hopeful that they could do something about it. And I think that's what the Rashi says, Lo hoya roitzim lotzeis. That's based on a medrash. If you look at the next box, the medrash says, Cheshech lo mehevi alein nisparach shemesh HaKadosh Baruch Hu, she'ein lefonav masaponim, there's no favoritism. V'hu chayke leiv u'beichin klais, HaKadosh Baruch Hu penetrates our innermost thoughts. The fishahu poishim b'Yisrael shoyalehem, because there were some sinners in Klal Yisrael. Oishe v'kavod, they had wealth and honor. V'lo hoy roitzim lotzeis, they didn't want to go. So they were the 4/5. But all of Klal Yisrael, says Rav Berman, were somehow caught up in Avodah Zarah. It's just a question of attitude. The 4/5 felt they were stuck and they didn't want to leave. They wanted to stay there. There was nothing they could do. They gave up hope. But 1/5 recognized, yes, I've got a problem, but there's something I can do about it. I'm still hopeful and we can resolve it. And that's how perhaps you can reconcile these two things. Okay, let's move on to one final idea. The final idea, paragraph 3, it's a very beautiful idea. That relates to the Mon. The Pasuk says at the end of the Sedra, I'm going to shower down bread from heaven, and they'll collect the Mon day in, day out. Now, I came across this, my Chavrusa Alan Becker shared this with me, I think last year or the year before. Again, I put up my Parsha notes to take it out and to share it at the opportune time. He shared with me something that he saw in a sefer called the Margolius Hashas, which goes through sort of daf by daf in Shas with some very beautiful ideas. So this one relates to the Parsha of Mon in this week's Sedra. He quotes a Gemara in Chagiga, the very, very end of the Gemara Chagiga. The Gemara says there in Chagiga Chavav on the base, but Chagiga daf Chavav, Olomdu, this is the last page, the last box on the page. In times of old, when the Beis HaMikdash stood, the Oili Regalim would come up to Yerushalayim 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkos, and the Kohanim would do something very interesting. They would be Magbia, they would lift up the Shulchan, and they would show Klal Yisrael the Lechem Haponim that was on the Shulchan, and they would say, Re'u chibaschem lifnei hamokim. Look how precious, how cherished you are in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Ki osa neis gadol, that he did this remarkable miracle, Belechem Haponim, Shoyacham B'meshech Kol Yimei HaShavua, that it's piping hot all week. The Lechem Haponim was baked on a Friday, and it remained fresh and hot until the following Shabbos, 9 days later, when it was eaten and distributed by the Kohanim, and the next batch of Lechem Haponim replaced it. So they would lift it up and they would show this steaming hot Lechem Haponim, like when you take challah out of the oven, it's piping hot and you can see the steam come out of it. That's what they showed them, Ru'uchi Baskem. So I saw he said in this Magores Hashas, a beautiful question. V'kasha, second paragraph. This wasn't the only miracle that happened in the Beis HaMikdash. There were 10. Why does the Lechem Haponim demonstrate the preciousness of Klal Yisrael in the eyes of Hashem more than the other Nisim. This one they showed Oler Regalim. They could have showed them there were other miracles. For example, on the Mizbeach you had fire, and there was smoke coming up, but the smoke wouldn't sort of wander around in the in the wind and be blown around. There was a single pillar of smoke that went up that wasn't affected by the wind. So show them that and say, Ru'uchi baschem lefnei hamokum. Why dafka is it the lechem aponim that was shown to the Oler Regalim to demonstrate the preciousness of Klal Yisrael in the eyes of Hashem? Venira, look at this. Tehine, Issa b'yuma daf ayin vav. It says in the Gemara in Yuma daf ayin vav, Sha'alu talmidav Reb Shimon ben Yochai. They are, the students asked Reb Shimon ben Yochai, Mipnei ma lo yorad hamon pa'amachas b'shana. Why is it that the mon didn't fall once a year? Ela b'chol yom v'yom, it fell every single day. V'heishiv v'moshel, and he responded to his students with the following moshel. L'melech of a king, Shehola ben Yochid v'ov, who had one beloved son. Pasuk lem was an os of pa'amachas b'shana. He supported him, and he gave him his money, his food, once a year. And therefore he only saw his father once a year to take his stipend. The father was very upset with that. He wanted to see his son every day. And therefore he decided, rather than give you your mazonos once a year, instead, I'll give it to you daily, every single day. So too Klal Yisrael. Someone who was married, he had children. I've got a lot of expenses, I've got mouths to feed. What's going to be if there's no mon tomorrow? Will perish. And therefore, instead of getting the mon once a year and just saying, here you go, the whole thing was miraculous. So just let it fall once a year, put it in the cupboard, and every day take out a bit. HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't want that. He wanted the tefillahs, the daily tefillahs of Klal Yisrael, the day in, day out, they would turn to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And therefore he made it full once a day. And not more rarely than that. Shashem Yisparach mechabe b'Is Yisrael, because HaKadosh Baruch Hu loves Klal Yisrael. U'miskagea kavyocha she'yikabel panav b'chol yom, and he wants that daily connection. V'zeh she'omru, and that's pshat. Sheheru lo halechem aponim, because the lechem aponim is the same thing. Why didn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu just say there's one lechem upon him, you'll bake it once a year, it will stay fresh the whole year, a miracle's a miracle, in for a penny, in for a pound? And why is it that you have to change it every single week? This is just a demonstration of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants that more regular connection. And that therefore demonstrates, they lifted up the lechem upon him and they showed it to Klal Yisrael and they said, look, ru'uchi baskem, take a look at this. It shows the preciousness that HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, that connection. It shows how beloved we are in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That he quotes from a Maharam Tiktin, Zatzal, who was a 17th century Gadol in Eastern Europe. So, let's just summarize the three things we've said and we'll finish. The first idea is the kasher of the Ibn Ezra. Why didn't the Ibn Israel fight back? Says the Ibn Ezra, because they had a slave mentality, which stems very well, which fits in very well with Ibn Ezra in Parshas Shemos. Why was it that Moshe Rabbeinu grew up in the palace of Paro? One of the answers he gives is that Moshe couldn't have a slave mentality. He needed to have a royal mentality with the confidence. He didn't need to be restricted like a circus elephant. But like Rav Belsky's bedtime lullaby and like Senator Joe Lieberman, the Lubavitch found a way to get the meal to him. Therefore, that conditioned Moshe Rabbeinu. Klal Yisrael, on the other hand, had spent decades being persecuted, and that's why they couldn't entertain the possibility of fighting back. Mash'enkin Moshe Rabbeinu said, "Al tiru v'hisyatzvu u'es Yeshuas Hashem." Then we had that fascinating question: Halalu of David Zara, Halalu of David Zara. Yet we're told that the 1/5 weren't Rishonim. They were worthy to be saved. So only the 4/5 were Rishonim. So how do you reconcile that? Says Rav Berman, you're right. Enochanami, they all worshipped David Zara. But 4/5 felt they were stuck and there was nothing they could do. Only the 1/5 recognized the problem and they still felt hopeful that there was something they could do about it. And lastly, the Lechem upon him and the Mon both demonstrate the closeness which HaKadosh Baruch Hu fills with us, how cherished we are in His eyes, that He wants that connection with us. Thank you.